Hi, Greg. How you doing?
Pretty good, Hugh. It's October, time for a full moon video.
You look terrible. You look really bad. Are you sick?
What are you talking about? I'm more handsome than ever. I get a little better looking every day.
No, you don't. I told
Now
you.
I'm 100% sure. See, look how dark my hair still is compared to yours. See that?
I don't have any hair.
Exactly. See my point?
Elon Musk is wearing my hat.
Yeah, what's that about?
Same thing. They blew up the bridge in Russia that links Russia to Ukraine, and then they put my wife's initial on it, ZV. That's Victoria's initials.
What's the Z? I mean, Victoria Squire, but what's the Z?
Her murder, you know, that state policeman from Senator Graham's state was looking right at her when they slit her throat Halloween Eve. And they cut her ears off. I had to bury her minus her ears. And they called that natural causes. They dismembered her, sodomized her, and slit her throat Halloween Eve. While Senator Graham's state policeman watched on. And police in Johnson City, Tennessee, and Greenville, Tennessee, used fake names and badge numbers on the murder reports and the break-ins at her home as she was murdered twice. Remember, I found her dead, revived her, gave her CPR, flew her to the hospital, and then 35 days later, they slit her throat on Halloween Eve. Well, Senator Graham's state policeman looked in on her. And then they called that natural causes. And you know what else happened before they murdered Victoria? You have Marjorie Taylor Greene in Rome, Georgia. And who is she? She's a congressman or a senator or something from Georgia?
Yeah.
Congressman?
I forgot what state, but yeah, congressman.
Georgia. She's from Rome, Georgia. Well, when I first moved Vicky and Terry to Tennessee, Greene County, Tennessee, I was supposed to go meet my Uncle Joe's kid, Joe Squire, Karen Squire. And Karen Squire had multiple sclerosis, and she moved from Atlanta, Georgia to Rome, Georgia, Christmas Eve. She got a new apartment.
Yeah.
And I called her up to come visit her Christmas Eve like we had planned, and she'd been murdered. And that's where Marjorie Taylor Greene is from, Rome, Georgia. And that's not coincidence, because they do anything but mention my murdered wife. And 2 police departments used fake names and badge numbers on 2 murder reports, one in Greene County and then one in Johnson City. And Johnson killed the Duncan kids when they murdered JFK. And I have no doubt about that because I was there. And then he called my family's home about the 5 dead Duncan kids. And, so they murdered Karen Squire in Rome, Georgia, where Marjorie Taylor Greene is from. And they never mentioned my 4 murdered wives or my 24 murdered kids in any news. And I'm the truth of JFK and his brother's murders. I'm the truth of that. And you know, I was kidnapped with Sirhan's kid when we were 4, and my identical twin was brought to me from California with Sirhan's kid. And they beat my identical twin to death that night. Long and Wallace and Osborne and Darrell Hall and Anderson and Andrews, they did that. They beat my identical twin to death. And Senator Graham's news media, Channel 4 and WWJ, the complete blackout in all news of my life.
Yeah.
Being kidnapped, my twin being murdered, the Oakland County child killings, it's all a complete blackout as he hires Roseanne Barr, O'Brien, who's my family. O'Brien is my family. Roseanne Barr lived next door to me. And I lived on Hoover Street. And you can look back and see pictures of my cousin, Marilyn Monroe with J. Edgar Hoover. None of this is coincidence. As I was kidnapped at 4, my father's hands were cut off by Pratt. In Maryland, where they planned Victoria's murder on a 3D chat in Maryland and Connecticut, you have the World Trade Center on Pratt Street. And that's where they planned my third wife's murder, in Maryland and Connecticut. And I don't think these things, I know these things, but because when my wife was murdered and Terry Heath was murdered, the police told me they were going to leave these murders up to God because it wasn't their fault the White House was corrupt. That's what 2 police sheriffs told me. One in Greene County, named after Marjorie Taylor Greene's family, and one in Johnson City. They never filed murder reports. And my attorney on his way to the district attorney's office was also murdered as they slit my wife's throat Halloween Eve. And I had hired him to file murder charges. And then the state policeman from Senator Graham's state told me he was going to watch me because he thought I was going to kill my wife. And I loved my wife. I took care of her and her family for 30 years. I loved her. And we got along really good.
Yeah.
As he was in her room, her throat was slit. And somebody used the Walters, her advocate was Barbara Walters' family, Miss Walters. And they screamed in a heavy metal voice, Slater in the phone as they slit her throat Halloween Eve. And Senator Graham's state policeman was right there in the room watching over her and trying to tell me I murdered my own wife after I found her dead, gave her CPR and flew her to the hospital. That's what they were trying to say. And that's nothing new in my life. They tried to tell me I murdered my family member, Jimmy Hoffa. They tried to tell me I robbed a bank. And then they murdered kids all around me in Oakland County for 70 years now. The Duncan kids. The Duncan kids were murdered on the same day they murdered JFK. And then Johnson called my family's home about the 5 Duncan murdered Duncan kids.
Didn't you just send me an email about another D'Angelo that was killing kids up there in the same place?
Yeah, another one. And then there was a cop, D'Angelo, who built D'Angelo's Pizza on Hughes Street, property I owned at birth, next to Baker College. He was a serial killer and he was a policeman in Hazel Park, Michigan, D'Angelo.
Didn't he kill like some 200 and some people?
Over 200 women.
It's unreal.
On Highway 5 in California.
Yeah.
And they put him in jail about 3 years ago. These policemen.
Now, can you tell? Go ahead.
You know, I was sitting in L. Brooks Patterson's office in 2017, and they tried to put me in jail as I reported Hall and Osborne and Anderson murdering my twin. They tried to put me in jail, and they couldn't because I don't do anything wrong. And as I was sitting in L. Brooks Patterson's office, and he was still alive then, they murdered 3 more kids in my family in Michigan. Tony Jr. and my brother's kid, Tony Jr., my bass guitar player's kid, Tony Jr. And I and Karen had a daughter named Serena. They murdered Serena and 2 Tonys. As I sat in L. Brooks Patterson's office, and none of these murders are ever put in the news. And they write them all off as coincidence. So I had 3 kids in my family murdered as I went back to Michigan to report the Oakland County killers. They murdered 3 more kids as I sat in L. Brooks Patterson's office, and they tried to put me in jail as they murdered my kids. You got this picture?
Clearly, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm still here making videos. I have people all the time tell me I murdered my wives, and I didn't murder my wives. The people that murdered Jimmy Hoffa, my family member, murdered my wives.
Now,
And
Hugh, I wanted to throw a little bit of history about something in here with this, but
okay,
to set it up,
I've said all I wanted to say. This is the anniversary of them murdering my wife, Victoria, 7 years
Yeah.
after murdering my wife, Terry Heath.
yeah,
And Terry Heath was murdered on my birthday, hung in her dog's leash by 2 off-duty policemen. And Victoria was murdered by 9 Americans, and one of them was a state policeman from South Carolina watching right in her room as she was murdered.
mhm.
And that's Senator Graham, who owns the media in Michigan. Graham owns the media in Michigan that hid my twins' murder with Camille Sirhan back in 57, 11 years before they framed Sirhan for Bobby Kennedy's murder, after framing Oswald for JFK's murder. And I'm the truth of these things. And all of this, you go forward to 9/11, and those people stole patents and trademarks from me that amounted to over $3 trillion to date. And they hid the receipts in the Twin Towers. And it wasn't Arabs doing this or Middle Eastern people from Saddam Hussein. America, London, and Israel did this with Germany and France. And I'm the living proof of this. And on 9/11, they blew up my civil rights case against the family, the Groves family that built the Pentagon. And that case was about them stealing from me, my trademark, bottom line. And the entire lawyers bar in this country used my stolen trademark to study to pass the bar exam. So every judge, every lawyer in the country studied out of my stolen property for over 50 years now, after they stole $3 trillion from me. So now I want you to go on and you just tell people what you found out about my family in Boston and Ohio and Virginia. And I already know Admiral Byrd's my family, and my cousin piloted the Enterprise in Vietnam, and my brother ran Fort Knox during Vietnam. What did you find in your research, Greg?
Well, as you know, I'm a tour guide now at the museum and in Marietta. And that's the first city in the Northwest Territory for those watching the video that don't know the history of Ohio and the Northwest Territory. But the 5 states, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin, were the Northwest Territory, carved out of the Northwest Territory after the Northwest Ordinance. Well, the man who put together the Ohio Company of Associates name was Rufus Putnam. And
People
he's
don't
one
know.
of
I worked with Putnam family.
Yeah, I know.
I and Putnam worked with Bob Seger's musicians in Troy, Michigan, when I was 18 years old.
Right. So this is going to tie it, and this is going to be really interesting because it ties to your life.
I am the Fuller and the Harris family. And my grandparents, Fuller and Harris, were murdered with semis, and their whole family was murdered with semis, their children and their children's children. The people they didn't kill with the semi when they hit them coming out of church, they went back and ran them over in their own driveways.
Right. Well, let me keep going with it, Hugh, so people can follow what I'm saying, okay? Because they're going to get lost in the details if we, but then go back and explain it so it makes
So I just wanted
sense.
people to know that I'm the Putnam and the Harris and the Fuller family.
Oh yeah, I'm getting there. So Rufus Putnam, right now, so he led the Ohio Company of Associates, and he helped oust the British from Boston when he was instructed by George Washington to build fortifications around Dorchester Heights.
This was before we were a country.
Yeah. And I think it was 1775, I think.
1740.
Huh?
I think it was 1740.
No, you're talking about the French and Indian War. No, this was during the Revolution.
Well,
So
in the French Indian War, my family was the beginnings of Smith and Wesson, and an Indian chief actually murdered one of the Harris family members, and that Indian chief gave me the gun he took from my family member 250 years later.
yeah, I know. Now, but let me keep going with this. Now, if you distract me too much, I can't keep my thoughts together, and my thoughts are loose how
I'm
they
not
are.
going to
So,
interrupt you anymore. I just wanted people to know that I'm the Fuller, the Harris, and the Putnam family.
yeah, yeah,
And George Washington gave my family his sword in the first Masonic temple.
right. And that's what we're talking about here, is that Rufus Putnam did not know how to build the fortifications. So what he did was he borrowed a book from General Heath. Now that's very interesting.
That's my murdered wife.
Exactly. Now that's Sarah Heath Palin and your murdered wife, Terry. Yeah.
Terry
So
Heath, that's correct. And Terry Heath created the Head Start program. She was
yeah.
Ronald Reagan's role model for Head Start, President Ronald Reagan.
So Putnam taught himself how to build the fortifications and became George Washington's friend. Now, right there in the museum itself, you see the sword presented by George Washington to Rufus Putnam. 5 blocks away is the cemetery. It's in where an Indian mound is now, and the many Revolutionary War veterans are buried there, including Rufus Putnam. And what we see in this cemetery is that we see Putnam's married to Fuller's, and even and Fuller's married to
Day,
Harris, wasn't it?
Harris and Day.
Yeah.
And
And
that's where the world got Doris Day from, because my family owned the silent films in New York. Schwartz Video, that's what we owned.
and we have Waldo in this cemetery, and Rufus Putnam's father was married to Fuller. So there's,
And Waldo is the woman who lived next door to me here in California. And I found her dead in her house. And then after leaving Robin Williams, my cousin's house, Robin Williams, I came home, found Waldo dead, and then they renamed the Waldo Bridge the Robin Williams Bridge. And all these things are interrelated.
right.
And they
Then
go
we have,
all the way back to Boston with
yeah.
George Washington and my family.
Yeah, that's why that Indian gave you the gun back that was used in a battle from long ago, and they said
Right.
it goes to your family.
He
So
said
they know exactly what family you're in.
Yeah, it was a Smith and Wesson blunderbuss, but it wasn't called Smith and Wesson yet. And when you took the plate off, it said 1700 and Harris on it. I'm Harris.
Now it'll be interesting. Now get this, Hugh. I'm going to go back to more of the cemetery in a second, but get this, okay? There was a treaty signed in 1795, and I present this in all my tours, okay?
All right.
And this is the treaty that pushed the Indians to the northern part of Ohio and allowed for Rufus Putnam and the settlers to settle without interference in southern Ohio and most of Ohio. And it was called the Treaty of Greenville. Now, isn't that interesting that your wives were attacked with the help of Indians
And
in
murdered
Greenville?
in Greenville. Yeah, Apache Indians murdered her there.
See, that's not a coincidence.
Apache Indians also murdered Hoffa and JFK.
Now
And
get this, the Treaty of Greenville.
I'm the living proof of this.
The Treaty of Greenville was signed by Mad Anthony Wayne, the same Wayne from Wayne County, Michigan.
Right, and that's where I was born. And Dr. Barker delivered I and my twin. And then we were kidnapped with the Sirhan family when we were 4. After my father's hands were cut off by the owner of the street the Twin Towers were on, Pratt Boulevard.
Right.
Mr.
Pratt is also in the cemetery, and so is Barker, who came with Rufus Putnam, one of the original 47, and you were born on the 4th of the 7th month,
Right.
July. And Barker built the furniture for Rufus Putnam and became a furniture maker and a boat builder. And he also built the boats that Aaron Burr rode on, or would have rode on had he not been arrested.
So there's a lot of history in my family before we were even a country.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then-
These are the same families all together in the same place.
And I'm related to all the kings in Europe also. Not just all the presidents on US money, but also to all the kings in Europe.
Now, in this cemetery, we have a row of the Booth family, which isn't a coincidence at all.
No.
And Rathbone was all around here and became a famous oil man here on the West Virginia side.
And that would be the Willard movie, the Rat movie.
Okay.
That
I remember you talking about that.
Marked an Apache Indian in my life.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
and Rathbone was with Clara Harris at Ford's Theater, sitting up in the presidential booth where Lincoln was.
And then I'm the Harris family.
Mm-hmm. And they own that. They discovered the wells in West Virginia and made a bunch of people millionaires overnight. And that's not far from land that George Washington owned there in what's now West Virginia, then Virginia.
Yeah, and it's on a river named after me.
Yeah, on the Hughes River. That's right. Thank you for reminding me. And then also in this cemetery is Buckminster, and the same. So you have the Buckminster name and next to the Fullers.
That's the patents that were stolen from me when my twin was murdered. And then my own family went on and stole my inheritance from Mr. Harris, which was a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Christie family and the Gonzalez family, my mother's sisters, stole my inheritance with one of my half brothers. And they divided it up amongst themselves, bought themselves houses and whatever. And gave me.
So there we see the inventor Buckminster Fuller's name right there in the cemetery. Not him, but the origin of the names where it was passed down somehow.
Right. And then that was the Fuller transmission, my grandmother in Battle Creek, Michigan. We put that Fuller transmission in all the semis with Cummins, who is Melky the Clown, Claire Cummins in Detroit. And DuPont and Claire Cummins, Jesse Ventura, Steve Austin stole my trademark Bottom Line before I was 18 years old. I think I was 15 years old when they did that. And I was a publisher from Foley Federal Court in ASCAP and BMI. And that trademark and my business were worth over $2.5 trillion.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned a minute ago the Waldo name. Well, the Waldos also married into the Putnam family. And also we have Ralph Waldo Emerson, who preached at the local church, the Unitarian Church, right down just a couple blocks from this cemetery.
Walton hides me with George Knapp and the Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. They never say the truth of Hoffa's murder or Kennedy murders or my kidnap and my twin murder with the Sirhan family.
Not Walton, Waldo. We're still talking about Waldo.
Oh, but Walton fits in here too. Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
So this is so Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? So is married into the Waldo family, is married into the Putnam family. Now you have.
So essentially, I found 2 of my own cousins dead, Robin Williams and then Sherry Waldo. They renamed the Waldo Bridge to Robin Williams Bridge, and my own family did that.
Right. Well, right there at the Unitarian Church, there was another woman who's related to you, Sarah Margaret Fuller Ossoli,
Yeah,
and she was Poe's literary critic and also a contemporary of Edgar Allan Poe and a ancestor of Buckminster Fuller,
right.
and also uh, spent some time in Trinitarian churches in her family, or Unitarian rather, not
Now, when you
Trinitarian,
say
Unitarian.
Unitarian, do you mean the Unitarian Church in Chicago nowadays?
That I think is a unification church or something like that. That's different. No, the Unitarian Church was that goes back to transcendentalism with Ralph Waldo Emerson and that.
Okay, okay. I never studied that religion. I'm just asking.
Yeah, yeah, that's different.
Because
Uh,
both of those churches are related to me. And the reason is because I'm related to King James, who gave you the King James Bible. I'm also related to Schofield and to Smith, who gave you the Mormon Bible. So my family wrote and authored 3 Bibles.
yeah,
And then I was raised to be a priest. I didn't become a priest, but I did own a ministry in the Bible Belt.
right, yeah. Um, Now I just learned this yesterday. There was, and I wish I could have remembered the name, but there was a uh, Teamsters man who was either the first hanging or the only hanging. There people talking, and we were outside. I didn't catch the details perfectly when this person was telling me, but a all the way back in the 1850s.
I believe the Teamsters were the post office back then. They called them Teamsters because they ran the mail on stagecoaches.
Mhm.
And when
Well,
you
this guy, he was a Teamster, but he would steal horses for the North and the South. So it had to have been the 60s, I guess. So it was during the Civil War.
they were still doing horses, not trucks and cars.
Yeah, yeah. So he would steal horses, take him to the South, and say, "Hey, I found your horses," and get
And
some
that's
money. Then
why
he'd
the
steal the horses from the South,
that's
take
why
him up north.
that's why the truck Teamsters are 2 horses.
Oh, well, that's perfect. So that's what this guy was doing. Well, anyway, he was murdered, and the guy that murdered him threw him in the river, and then he was the first. The guy that murdered him was the first hanging, or the only hanging, one or the other, in the Northwest Territory by that time.
That became Ohio.
That became Ohio, right?
And my family built Ohio.
Yeah. So I was taking a tour, and I saw the spot where the gallows had
My
been,
family
where he was hanged.
my family built the Capitol in Virginia. And then you had Harris County, Texas, and none of that's all my family.
Right, right. Now we have another name, also buried in the cemetery, and he was one of the first doctors that came here very early on in the settlement. So his name was Samuel Prescott Hildreth, and Prescott would be George Bush's family.
And that's who lied to the world and then said my name by mistake after they stole my business bottom line in New York. On the day the first plane hit the Twin Towers, and then they blew up my civil rights case in the Pentagon, where I had a civil rights case against the family that built the Pentagon. And George Bush's friends in the Air Force are the ones that blew up the towers. And I've known all along that London, France, Germany, and America blew up my receipts in the Twin Towers and my civil rights case in the Pentagon. I've told everybody that, but nobody ever believes me. And all of this was done after George Washington handed my family his sword in the first Masonic temple before we were a country.
Yeah, and I'll explain that too, because it's interesting. And I made another video about it, but we'll just go ahead and tell the story real quick. But the first Masonic Lodge in America was at Boston at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern. And what would happen is back during the French and Indian War, we would fight with the 47th Regiment of Foot in battles against the French and Indians, right? So during the Revolution, and they would all meet at this tavern. So we had our generals and their generals that would all meet at this tavern. Well, and it was also the site of the first Masonic Lodge. Well, during the Revolution, the 47th Regiment of Foot became our enemy, right? So they declared the Declaration of Independence, obviously, on July 4th, right? So 7-4, or the 4th of July, 4-7, however you want to look at it. So now when Rufus Putnam comes to Ohio, he establishes the first Masonic Lodge in the original fort settlement there. And he does it on 4-7, the April 7th, though, this time, the 4th month and the 7th day, bringing 47 settlers with him. So, or total 47, counting him. And so 47, you know, so they're reflecting this number. So this number is real important to our history. So you're born on that day, and you had received invitations yourself, because growing up, people knew that your descendants could potentially become presidents, and even you received an invitation.
I was asked to be president twice, and
by people that had the money to make it happen, not just anybody, right?
Corporations.
Yeah.
And I refused the job because I'm not educated enough to do that.
Which is interesting that you say that, because you're probably the most educated person I've ever met.
Oh, I'm very smart. I was a college teacher at 14, but the kind of problems facing the world and the media, they hide me in everything.
Right.
And
so what I've seen, Hugh, is I have seen them
all three.
In order to,
let me say this, Greg, all three political parties, the Independent Party, the Republican, and the Democrat parties, all three of them have murdered my family members and stolen money from me for over 50 years. So if I were to run for president, all three political parties would run against me.
Yeah.
And I'm not,
I believe that. Yeah.
I'm not smart enough to get around them, because they call, and I've had 4 wives murdered. And when my wives are dismembered, 3 of them have been dismembered. The White House hires state policemen to say that the murders are natural causes. And these are dismembered bodies. So it's very hard for me to get around the Democrats, the Republicans, and the Independents, who have murdered my family 5 times. My entire family has been murdered 5 times by those 3 parties after they stole money from me at birth.
Well, see, it's interesting how you say that, because the way it looks like is they're getting around you, and the way they're doing it and around your history and your family is by using, I mean, one of the ways is by using that number 47 to appear to be legitimate. Like you had Joe Biden had been in the Senate for 47 years, and Trump was 74 years old when he ran.
Every judge and every attorney in the country studied out of my stolen trademark, bottom line, and they all know this, but none of them will admit this. And then I'm never allowed on American news, but I've been on news stations in every country in Europe.
Right. Yeah.
Ever since they murdered Sarah Heath in Victoria. The CIA has interviewed me for 3 hours, and then they created Q to hide me.
Yeah, which sounds like Hugh.
CIA
yeah, I
did.
know. Right.
And then my family, all of my wives, their fathers were in World War II in the Navy, Special Forces with John F. Kennedy. And Special Forces didn't exist till after World War II, but all of my murdered wives, their fathers were Navy Special Forces who served with Kennedy in World War II, all 4 of them. But I'm not newsworthy. Just the fact that George Washington handed my family his sword before we were a country, I should have been in somebody's newspaper somewhere. but I'm not.
Yeah, yeah, just that. That's epic, right?
And yeah, so I'm the first Masonic lodge in the country. And then I'm related to all the presidents on US money, but I'm not newsworthy. Jimmy Hoffa is my family member. And now I have a family that traded slaves and with the kings of Europe and brought them to America, Kamala Emhoff, using my family's name. And she wants to run to be president, and she's not my family. And my family was with Lincoln, who ended slavery. The Harris family was with Lincoln in Ford Theater as he was murdered. And then Kamala Harris, her and her husband, she was a prosecutor in Detroit. And I was with Eddie Murphy, Denzel Washington, the Chicago Cubs, all of these Black African families suppressed my truth as I lived with Michael Jackson's family and drove semis in Jimmy Hoffa's union across the country. And then I was detained for Hoffa's murder before Chucky O'Brien was. And James Hoffa is my family member. He's married into the Harris family. And your research, you found all of this, haven't you?
Yeah, I also found the builder of that the Unitarian Church was Nahum Ward, and buried right next to Putnam is Ward and Andrews, like literally right beside him.
And you know that the Ward family introduced you to me and asked you to write my book.
And one of the streets in Marietta, and all the streets are named after somebody from the Revolution. I just don't know who he is, but
you know that I've known the Ward family my whole life, and you also know that the Ward family was kidnapped as a kid, the same as I was.
Right. Now get this: there's Montgomery Street, and we have Ward at the cemetery and Ward that built the thing, and then the store Montgomery Wards, and then you had problems with them also.
Yeah. Yeah, they sent 30 lawyers after me for $100. I had to file bankruptcy after 2 women attempted to murder me. I couldn't get back to work. I was running Acme Cleveland out of Ohio, the corporation. 2 women attempted to murder me in front of Bob Seger's house. As I played music with Bob Seger and Bill LeVice, who was Mitch Ryder, writing songs for Elvis. And I knew all these people and played music with them growing up. I played solo in Ted Nugent's club, I Rock.
Mm-hmm.
I played in restaurants that Sylvester Stallone and Antonio Banderas owned. And then I played for almost 50 years as Bottom Line, and that was my publishing company and my trademark. And I was on the radio. Mm-hmm. But on the day they murdered James Hoffa, they pulled me off the radio, and nobody ever heard from me again on the radio. But I still played with Styx, Wayne Newton's band, Ted Nugent's club, Sherry's, which was Sherry Waldo, who they renamed the Robin Williams Bridge. I worked for that milkman who drove a milk truck I owned the patent on when I was 14. It was called Cupid's Den in Madison Heights, Michigan. And then it became Sherry's, which was Sherry Waldo. And then I worked for Helen, and I played at Coleman Young's weddings, his niece's weddings. I knew Eddie Murphy and Gilbert Hill when they made the movie in Key West. I even drove back from Key West, Florida to Detroit with Gilbert Hill and Eddie Murphy. And Denzel Washington's family. The Washington brothers were linebackers on the Chicago Cubs and then the Detroit Lions back then. And I even wrote a song about their sister, Anthianetta Washington, who was my secretary at IBM. back when Eddie Murphy and Gilbert Hill made the first movie. And I lived at the Hemingway house in Key West. And I'm not newsworthy.
Now you mentioned Waldo and Williams. Well, we talked about Waldo here, and also Williams is important also because without a Mr. Williams, the colony, well, when a colony, the settlement would probably have starved to death in the winter of 89, 90 when their crops failed.
All of my family members were in the first colonies. I know all this. The Gates
Well,
family. Bill
Gates is there too. Gates is also in the cemetery.
That's my cousin. His mother is Gardner. I'm the Gardner family.
Right. And I forgot to mention Gardner. Gardner's all over this story.
Did you find Jacob there? Because Jacobs is my father, and he gave my cousin Gates the software to make his first computer, as I worked with his partner, Paul Allen and Alan Llewellyn.
Right. No, I don't think I saw Jacobs.
And then Apple Computer, Cook and Perry are my cousins.
Cook is there.
I know all these things.
Mm-hmm. And Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry, of course, won the Battle of 1812 on the Great Lakes.
My father gave the software to my cousin at my wedding because I married his stepdaughter, Nancy, whose father was mayor of East Detroit, where you get all the musicians like Ted Nugent and the B-52s from.
Right.
The Ramones.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not newsworthy. And I was their publisher, Greg, and my publishing license from Foley Federal Court. And they told you that Foley was beheaded after 9/11. They were making fun of stealing my trademark, bottom line, and then blowing up the receipts of my civil rights case in the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And that George Bush and his friends were doing that.
Yeah.
And then it's real interesting that Donald Trump borrowed all that money from my family's banks, Harris Banks and Chase and Morgan and Mellon Banks. And that was my wife, Mellon Banks.
Well, yeah, Putnam's made banks around here too, interestingly enough.
Didn't Heath help push the British back in the first colony when we had the War of 1746? My other murdered wife, her ancestor was a general or someone.
General Heath, that's who Putnam borrowed the book from. But that's the Revolution again, not the French Indian War.
They pushed the British out of the country.
Yeah.
And they murdered my wife. Britain.
Now get this, Hugh.
Osborne's from Britain. He come back here, and Osborne's also in our military, and he runs the FBI right now. But the Osborne family kidnapped me and my twin and beat my twin to death. Five grown men beat my twin to death after kidnapping us with the Sirhan family in 1957. And there's no lie in this, but I'm not newsworthy.
Okay, well, get this. The first woman settler in the Northwest Territory was Mary Gardner Owen.
My family.
And also who came with Rufus Putnam was John Gardner, who had wandered around the outskirts of the secure location here, and was abducted by Indians, but he got away in the middle of the night and found his way back.
Oh, I grew up on an Indian reservation, Greg, if you remember.
Right. There's John Gardner. It's like a repeat of history.
You have right now, Gordon Lightfoot was on the reservation I was put on after I escaped the 5 governors that kidnapped me and murdered my twin. An Indian chief who liked my mother, who's in the Smithsonian next to my family, the Harris family, right now.
Yeah.
And he's dead now, but he made every president a headdress, a complete chief's headdress, and gave it to 30 presidents. He lived next door to me.
Also in the cemetery, here's another one. I don't even think I told you this.
He worked with me and lived in the same subdivision I lived in. We knew each other my whole life. And he gave every president who were my family a complete Indian headdress and ceded his power to the new president. And that was the biggest Indian tribe in America. And there's no lie in this.
Yeah.
He would sit and make the headdresses and talk to me at work. You understand this? And he was a machinist for me, just like my father was a machinist at Springfield, where they make guns.
Right. Here's another name that I don't even remember if I told you, but it definitely goes with your story. The founder of Marietta College and his relatives, and maybe him too, is buried in the cemetery, and that's Mills.
That's my uncle. And right now, Mills is funding the History Channel and Ancient Aliens, and they're doing that to hide my truth of who really murdered Kennedy.
Along with Moulton, who's also in the cemetery.
Moulton is married to my family, Howe.
And so is Howe, I believe.
I went to kindergarten with John Moulton. And they're hiding me. They're hiding my truth of who really murdered the Kennedys after they kidnapped me with Sirhan's kid and murdered my twin by beating him to death. And we were all chained together on a toilet where they were torturing and raping us. We were 4 years old.
Right. And Moulton Howe works at Ancient Aliens a lot of times.
And Mills funds it. And Mills is one of my uncles. Mills offered me millions of dollars through Elvis Presley's publisher in New York. I went to dinner with Stan Mills and B.B. Bourne, Elvis Presley's publisher, and a Twisted Sister. We all had dinner together. And Mr. Mills offered me several $1 million not to be a publisher. And I told him no. I became a publisher. And now Mills funds Ancient Aliens, which hide my truth of Hoffa's murder, JFK's murder, and a whole lot of other things. Oklahoma bombing, 9/11. I'm not newsworthy, but my family was handed George Washington's sword in the first Masonic temple before we were a country. And I'm related to all the presidents on U.S. money.
And here it all is, right here in one of the most important cemeteries in the country.
And
all together in the same place.
Every entertainment lawyer in the country used my stolen publishing license to become a lawyer and pass the bar. And now they're Supreme Court justices working for people like Trump and Clinton, Obama, Biden. And I grew up with Garland and Barr. Garland and Barr were both my neighbors growing up in Oakland County, Michigan. So you have Trump giving you Barr, who hid me with Graham after my twin was beat to death by Osborne, who runs the FBI. And Garland, he owned Travis Restaurants. And then he became a lawyer using my stolen trademark. And they all knew me. They were all in my neighborhood. And I performed in all the lounges in Detroit, Chicago, Oakland County, Macomb County for 50 years. They all know me and they know what they did to me. And Garland works for the Democrats and Barr works for the Republicans. And then the Paul family, they were my business manager. They sold me out to the Russian mafia.
Yeah.
He had cerebral palsy, Paul. And I grew up with the Paul family. And all three parties, they know they murdered my wives. They murdered kids all around me for 70 years now. I'm not newsworthy, Greg. So we make these videos and all of this, everything I say, you know, it's true. I didn't tell you about George Washington. And
no, I just found all this and it all goes together just like it should.
Who did I tell you about in the Masons?
The only Masons you've ever mentioned to me were those guys who came to your house. So what you're talking about?
Prior to that, you don't remember. They murdered my family member, Albert Pike.
Oh, right, right. Yep. Albert Pike. Yep.
And here where I live, the Pike daughters became doctors at the university my family built. Jackson built the university where Betty Ford's family became doctors and the Pike family became doctors at the VA University up in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah.
I'm the Jackson family. My family built the VA hospitals. We donated the land. They didn't necessarily build the hospitals, but my family built universities all over the country. Like they built Marietta College, Berkeley College. I owned the street Baker College was on at birth. And none of this is coincidence. It's because my family created the country. But I'm not newsworthy.
Right. Yeah, there it all is. There's no denying it. I mean,
Everybody denies it. If I tell people my wives were murdered, do you know the kind of responses I get from veterans and patriots?
deplorable responses.
Yeah,
Yes.
no, they tell me that's shit. I don't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
QAnon tells me that. Navy SEALs tell me that. I have people who stole $3 trillion from me. They try to murder me all the time.
People that are supposed to protect the country are the ones denying even the history of it, and they don't have anything to protect. So they're so disconnected from reality.
They invented Q, and I owned the Q-Bert game
And
computer.
a lot of them will believe that, right?
And I'm Q on Star Trek. Harv Bennett was my family's friend. So was Mayhew. Mayhew was Wookiee on Star Wars. Mayhew was my mother's best friend. That's Star Wars. That's Wookiee on Star Wars. There's a reason you have Harrison Ford. My family ran Henry Ford's mansion.
Yeah. I get that.
My family was with President Lincoln when he was shot by Booth. And then who else? I'm Baker, I'm Gardner, I'm Fuller. Baker, Gardner, and Fuller and Clara Harris was Lincoln's guest. They were all at Lincoln's murder. My whole family was there. But I'm not newsworthy, and I was kidnapped, tortured, raped, and my twin was beat to death by the guy that runs the sex crime division at the FBI right now. And I'm not newsworthy.
Osborne. Yeah, Mike Osborne, right?
Same family.
Yeah.
Kidnapped me at birth for the London throne.
Right. So the people that killed Kennedy took over the country from the founding families.
You have the Minnie Cooper in London. Cooper kidnapped my daughter and a Kennedy girl off her school bus when they were 7. I rescued them out of an excavation yard. They were locked in an earth mover. They were going to bury my daughter when she was 7 with one of the Kennedy girls. They were kidnapped off their school bus.
Hill, that's right.
By Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? But I'm not newsworthy. And Oakland County and Macomb County, Michigan sheriffs covered all this up in all news. I'm not talked about in any news, yet the FBI arrested me for Hoffa's murder. I bought Miller a house. Miller wrote a book after the FBI said they found my family member's blood in the house I bought for Miller. But I'm not newsworthy. I'm a publisher on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. Kennedy was starting his speeches off saying to you Tribune publishers as the Kennedy family was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not newsworthy. 5 kids at the Duncan household, and Mr. Duncan was my friend. Everybody had a Duncan yo-yo. Mr. Duncan was my friend all my life.
Mm-hmm.
His 5 kids were murdered. They told the world that. They all sat around the table and at the kitchen table and ate a box of poison. This is the biggest lie there ever was. And then President Johnson called my home as he replaced JFK. And Johnson is the Continental Divide. Then they were taking Oswald to Walker, Detective Walker, when Ruby shot him. And I rented the carousel from Ruby. only not in Texas. I rented the carousel in Michigan.
Yeah, and there's Walker, just like Prescott, George Bush's family.
And the road after Johnson Road, which is the Continental Divide, is Walker Boulevard, exit 357, a gun. And they want me to believe that they closed John Fitzgerald High School down as they killed Kennedy. And then they built Hazel Park High School on a street I owned at birth, next to Baker College. And then they told you Baker was cheating on my uncle, Mr. Baker, with Oswald, and Oswald killed Kennedy. And I'm telling you, this is all a lie.
And Baker was with Lincoln, or not with, but Baker investigated Lincoln's murder. Baker was with Reagan when he was shot in the hospital with him.
I'm going to take this a step further, Greg. Jackie Kennedy ran to a Greek man named Onassis as 5 governors were sticking their penises down my throat when I was 4.
Yeah.
She ran to Onassis after Kennedy was murdered. And then who stole my trademark, Greg? Alexa, stop. Who stole my trademark?
Paul.
No, DuPont.
Oh, well, yeah, right.
DuPont and Claire Cummins stole my trademark. Paul didn't steal anything. Paul worked for me. He sold my trademark out and my bass player out to the Russian mafia. De Blasio was my bass player. He was born in the Bronx.
I get you. Okay.
When he died of a heart attack, and Paul was our business manager, a Russian man took his name and became mayor behind Giuliani after 9/11. And this is a cover-up.
Mm-hmm.
It's the cover-up of my stolen trademark, bottom line, which was a federal publishing company. That when you have a federal license, the American military backed my license. You understand this? Not the police, the military.
Right.
My neighbors were military and they were framed.
Yeah.
For things like the Oklahoma bombing and my brother-in-law's Ryder truck.
Mm-hmm.
Mitch Ryder, his bass player, was my brother-in-law. I used to play with Mitch Ryder in my brother-in-law's backyard when I was 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I was their paper boy. Oh, and then you got Huey Lewis in the news to hide me after they stole my trademark. I had the biggest newspaper out in Detroit, biggest one. Mr. Gratiot gave it to me. Gratiot is the biggest street. I had 1,500 customers. I was Huey, playing music and the news. I had a paper route.
Mm-hmm.
I'd do my paper route and then I'd go play my music in great big lounges, strip clubs, all the underground clubs. I was in all the underground magazines. I was on the front page of the Detroit News and the Tribune. I was bottom line. I was being played on the radio. Then they told me I robbed a bank and murdered Jimmy Hoffa. When I was 19 years old, I had just adopted 5 kids and I murdered Jimmy Hoffa. Sure, I did.
Mm-hmm.
And that was because my mother-in-law's friend was Whitey.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up that teamster that was killed here and thrown in the river, because I know that's not coincidence.
And my mother-in-law was with Jimmy Hoffa when he disappeared.
Exactly.
State policeman husband buried Jimmy Hoffa. I pretty much said a whole lot here.
Yeah, that's a lot.
They hide me behind UFOs and aliens. My family built Area 51 and S4. Snyder is my family.
Well, that's a lot of history, Hugh, and it's been close to an hour. And plus, I'm going to have to turn in here shortly, so we should probably stop it here.
Let me know when my book's done so I can edit it. It needs to get out there before the next election. And you've researched me for 5 years now.
The proof's right there in front of us, if anybody cares to look at it.
I'm not newsworthy, am I?
Right.
I'm the most newsworthy person in the country, but they won't allow me on the news.
Mm-hmm.
Admiral Byrd's my family. He ran the CIA and funded it.
Yeah. Well, good night.
You have a good day. I'll put this up on your email, stick it up on YouTube and the groups.